We learned late last year, before the election, several days before the election, there's a public resource called the FBI Vault File, which if you just Google FBI Vault File, you'll see that after cases are disposed of, one way or another, frequently the FBI will put public information out there on that site. And so there are two separate dumps, one around November, I think, 1st or thereabouts, 2nd, 2016, and one several weeks after that, totaling about 600 pages. And the people in your crowdsource group who are familiar with FBI files will have a field day going through the many pages that are not redacted. Because what these confirm is that actually there was an FBI investigation. Actually, the U.S. Attorney was serious about it. And actually, by early December 2001, James Comey himself became the U.S. Attorney leading the charge out of the Southern District in this investigation. And on September 4th, 2001, a week, sadly, before the dread events of September 11th, Robert Mueller became the head of the FBI. So these notes show it gives names of many people who are involved. It doesn't give the names of the people who were interviewed, but it gives you the 4 federal code statutes that they were investigating, and they characterized the case as U.S. against William J. Clinton. And of the 4, and other people, and the 4 code statutes include public corruption, lying, and interfering in a government matter. So, I mean, you have it there before you. You can see that there was major league activity. It went on until early 2005. And, what shocked me when I first saw this is that, this is prima facie evidence on the FBI website put out to confirm that indeed there was an investigation, and that instead of driving to an indictment and to a conviction, it was just abandoned right around the time that this thing was opened up on November 18th, 2004. So Mueller and Comey were involved, actively involved, in certainly in Comey's case, leading for a time this investigation. They couldn't get the job done. Query, how hard were they really trying? Right. And were they going through the paces in that one? Now, so that's one early thing. Then the second thing, and what you can see from what's in the public domain, and mind you, the FBI, the U.S. Attorney, and others would have had a lot of information. They describe it as a gold mine or a treasure trove of information. Yes. Yeah, and they weren't able to put 2 and 2 together and see that this was obviously a charity fraud, because exactly in this time frame, exactly when Comey got involved, you could go and read Joe Conison's book. Now, Joe is a left-leaning, actually a very gifted author, and believe it or not, in his book, Man of the World, which came out right before the election last year, it's a balanced, fairly balanced, obviously it's pro-Clinton, but it's a fairly balanced book, and it talks about the pros and the cons of what was going on just at that time. That early in 2002, it recounts that Maggie Williams, the chief of staff of the Clinton Foundation then, began to work with Ira Magaziner on what it doesn't say in the book, but I can tell you was a completely illegal operation to subcontract in the name of the Clinton Foundation to Ira Magaziner's consulting company and various volunteers an effort to, in theory, fight HIV/AIDS around the world. It was never authorized lawfully in any jurisdiction, never accounted for properly. This started in 2002, just as the FBI was investigating, just as Comey was investigating, and the investigation went on for 3 years, and they couldn't catch anything. It's just preposterous. So, I'm not done.
Oh, go ahead.
All right, so that's the first leg. The second piece is that Mueller stays in as head of the FBI from September 4th, 2001 to September, I think it was around the same time, September 4th, 2013. So all along the way, first there's a botched, I would argue, a botched initial investigation. Then they let this Clinton Foundation metastasize into a global scandal. And then under Obama, as Hillary and Bill negotiate with the incoming Obama administration starting in November 2008, the Clinton Foundation is a disaster at that point. You can see that in the public filings. You can go to New York State, California, look at the 2007 annual report. look at the correspondence file. You'll look at Massachusetts and what happened to their core HIV/AIDS operation up in Massachusetts. You could tell it was flagrantly in violation of the law. Then you check in France in public records, and you'll see that the French government opened an investigation that took a while to go through, which uncovers massive improprieties. Now, they don't bring it home in France. They don't bring it across the finish line. They don't trigger a U.S. investigation. Who knows why that may have been covered up? There's some question in my mind as to who in France at that time may have looked at this and said, this is great. We have the Clintons. We have Obama in an embarrassing place. We have leverage. So,
right.
We don't yet really know what happened there. But all the while, Mueller is on top of the FBI at this time. In addition, the largest vendor, the largest company that was a vendor to this HIV/AIDS thing is a company called Ranbaxy. There, by February 14th, 2006, an investigation was opened that was ultimately led by Rod Rosenstein into Ranbaxy, and the question of whether they were selling, and we were buying through the Clinton Foundation and through our government, through PEPFAR, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, whether we were buying adulterated drugs and distributing them around the world. Finally, in 2009, and that thing stretched, that investigation took 7 years, from February of 2006 to May of 2013, and Rod Rosenstein's group did not catch that. So there are two more pieces. The third out of four pieces is that starting in 2008-2009 timeframe, Rajat Gupta, the now disgraced felon who at one point ran one of the largest, most significant consulting firms in the world, McKinsey, Rajat Gupta began to be under scrutiny, presumably by our FBI, again in the Southern District of New York, for insider trading. And his ties to the Clintons, should have been known by that time. They were, Rajat Gupta had been involved with connecting the Clinton Foundation up to Ranbaxy. He'd been involved hiring Chelsea Clinton in McKinsey. He'd been involved with a company called MindSpirit LLC. It's a matter of public record, funneling money to the Clintons without the complete disclosure of the significance of that, tracing all the related party connections. So that investigation, I would argue, didn't go as hard as it could have gone against Rajat Gupta. And then the final piece is that beginning in January 2010, something called the Clinton-Bush-Haiti Fund was organized. And in the 2010 filings for the Clinton Foundation, the largest donation, largest single expense item, largest single item was a grant of $37.2 million to the Clinton-Bush-Haiti Fund from the main fund. But the problem with it is they list the grant as going to Clinton-Bush-Haiti Fund in Maryland, where no such fund was ever registered. And this is, again, right under the nose of Rod Rosenstein. And I said there were four pieces. There's a fifth. The fifth piece is Laureate, the for-profit educational, I would argue, fraud that began as a leveraged buyout in 2006-07, operating from, again, Maryland, where Rod Rosenstein was a seated U.S. attorney, and they didn't seem to catch any of this. So, there are so many conflicts here and so many areas where if you had, the type of team that is apparently currently targeting Trump and has already managed, unlike in the Clinton Foundation investigation, to immediately get, it seems, a grand jury impaneled. I mean, if you had the same approach, the same fair-minded approach that in theory Mueller's taking against Trump, trained on these five strands I just told you about, we'd have to start building a large number of additional prisons to put away all the trustees and all the professionals, the accountants, the lawyers, the consultants, the donors. I mean, this is a gigantic mess.
Well, and so on that note, so you bring me to the second question, which is, a lot of us are sort of feeling a little bit helpless in that we see that our law enforcement systems at the federal and local levels are so corrupted that, prosecuting something like this seems impossible. But you've identified, an approach to this, through the tax side of things that seems like it really is, if you just got, it's the easiest route to successfully taking the whole thing down because of the way that the relationships work between the donors and the foundations. So can you talk a little bit about, start at the beginning in terms of where the foundation went wrong from the start, because I think you've said that, initially they were never set up properly, and then how that impacts all of these other foundations that have given to the Clinton Foundation.
Right. So when I started on this whole area of, exposing fraud, I began with a very complex entity, General Electric, which is, was at the time a $900 billion enterprise, counting the market value of its equity and its debt. So, much larger than the Clinton Foundation and far more complex. When you're in the area of for-profit land and investing, proving corporate fraud and investment fraud is very difficult. You have to prove what's called, it's a Latin term, scienter, S-C-I-E-N-T-E-R, which basically means knowing intent. You knowingly intended to defraud somebody. Then you have to prove that that action caused actual harm. And in corporate frauds, that's very difficult to do because corporations have armies of lawyers, and they always argue that all decisions are team decisions, and they always get legal opinions and accounting opinions, and they have something called the business judgment rule that gives boards of directors and executives amazing defenses.
Latitude,
in these types of, defenses, insulation. So, on the other hand, why I got involved so actively in this in the beginning, one of the important determining factors for me was when I realized that in charity fraud, there is no such obligation. All you have to do to prove solicitation and operating fraud is to prove that the disclosures on a charity like these, which are called public charities, they're continuously soliciting from the public. If you can show that the disclosures that the public have are false and materially misleading, that means that they contain material false, significant false statements, or they omit material information, which, if you knew it, might change your behavior. If you knew that they were bilking investors, if you knew that the executives had checkered records of the trustees, and that's withheld from you, and you make a donation, you could certainly argue that that's a material fact. So if you have materially misleading disclosures and you're soliciting, not collecting, soliciting, asking for money, and in particular asking for money across state lines, using the telephone, using the internet, using the mails, these are very serious crimes. And so generally what happens when you look at in charity land, thankfully, most people who operate charities, there are exceptions, but most people are honest. And they get involved in that work not because they're explicitly not to make money, but to give money away and to help people, and often to do it anonymously or without taking credit and holding that action over the heads of the recipient. So the laws are written such that when the IRS, which would be the federal IRS or a state taxing authority, smells trouble, they just simply contact the Attorney General in the state or the Department of Justice with the IRS, contacts the charity and says, listen, show us your books and you prove to us that you are complying with the law. Not the other way around. You prove to us. Another thing that's really crucial here is that you don't get unbridled license to operate a charity. The rules are actually pretty clever. You fill out an application, and it's a form called 1023. It's incredibly detailed. You may not lie on the form, and you are granted I would argue, a conditional license. I'm a cautious person. When you read the language, the IRS explicitly stated in January of 1998 when they granted the conditional, what's called a determination letter, that based on your submissions in this document, we are granting you federal tax exemption, assuming you carry out the activities and devote yourself for the purposes which are laid forth in this application. And it is crystal clear in the application that this was a domestic charity. That was not authorized to do any international activities. It was to be a building, an endowment to house the records of the two Clinton presidencies, to house what are called presidential records, which are defined by statute in the Presidential Records Act of 1978. So it's crystal clear. That's what it was supposed to be. House those public records, which are the property of we the people, and create a research facility so scholars can study those records. That's what this was authorized to do, and nothing more than that. And back when they applied, the application is out there in the public domain. It's on their website. It is crystal clear. They did not check the box marked 910 they did not enter the activity code 910, which is for international. They did not enter activity codes to fight HIV/AIDS or engage in climate change or any of these things. And these are specifically options that are available for you to mark. Moreover, when they registered in the states where they did register, they never said they were going to be international. They never said they were going to fight climate change. They never said they were going to do HIV/AIDS work in this early period. And there's no record that they ever amended their articles of incorporation, which is the only way that you can change your purposes. Now, here I have to draw an important distinction. The Clintons are fond of basically blurring meaningful distinctions. In the law, there is a major league, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm well coached by many lawyers. Foundations and charities are authorized to get federal tax exemption only for specific purposes, which are defined in Statute 501c3 and are limited. You are not allowed to go and set up the Trish Negron charity to do whatever suits your fancy tomorrow morning when you wake up. You have to say, this is the purpose, and it is exclusively charitable within the meaning of Statute 501c3, our Internal Revenue Code Statute 501c3. And their articles of incorporation control what that definition is. So you have to be precise in the articles of incorporation. And nowhere in any of the U.S. articles of incorporation does it state that the Clinton Foundation has the power to do all these things that they have in fact done and taken credit for, which are, I would argue, all illegal. Moreover, if you can believe this one, this is really astonishing. There are many, many agreements which you can find if you're persistent and you have time that are omitted from the Clinton Foundation website. A crucial one of these is what's called a joint use and operating agreement between the Clinton Foundation and the National Archives. Believe it or not, the record that I see shows that the president of the Clinton Foundation at the time, Skip Rutherford, and our magaziner, and I believe Bill Clinton, skillfully defrauded the National Archives themselves and failed to tell the National Archives that they had engaged in this new HIV/AIDS activity internationally, that they had created a new subsidiary. They do not disclose that in the documents I've seen. They do not disclose the application for this new entity. They do not disclose whether or not this new entity had ever gotten what's called a determination letter for that activity. I see no evidence that they ever got that that authorization. And so between April 20th, 2004 and November 18th, 2004, there is quite a public record of Clinton Foundation executives defrauding donors and even defrauding our National Archives. Because under the law, the way in which the Clinton Foundation organized its donation to the National Archives, they granted a 99-year license to use a portion of this facility in Little Rock to the National Archives. In order for that grant to be effective, the Clinton Foundation would have to be a lawfully organized and operated charity on the date of the grant, November 18th, 2004, and all the way forward. And they had broken their authority and put themselves, they are now in a position where, should we ever get a new head of the IRS who is honest, we certainly don't have one now, and a head of the head of the Charities Division who's honest, we also don't have one now. If we ever were to get fair-minded, honest people who would follow the law, they would take a look at this record, if they're not already doing so, and they would retroactively revoke the license of this charity as far back as, I would argue, the very beginning. And in so doing, they would present the trustees with a gigantic tax bill, and they would penalties and interest for corporate income taxes, as well as presenting significant donors like the Gates Foundation and others with gigantic tax bills. And when I say gigantic, I would see scope here at federal level, if I really wanted to be aggressive and send a message, for tens of billions of dollars in recoveries. Tens of billions of dollars. And then at state level, the tax rates are lower, so it's smaller amounts, but it's still in the many billions of dollars. And last I checked, the federal government's in deficit. Most of the big states are in deficit. I think we need to collect our tax revenue, and I think a lot of these people are very rich and have the wherewithal to pay their fair share of taxes.
Was there not an IRS audit in Dallas occurring last year? I thought I had read that at one point.
So what happened is there is one steely, at least one steely congressperson who happens to be a woman named Marsha Blackburn. And Marsha Blackburn was instrumental in pushing the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, to go after something alternatively called the Texas Cancer Charity Group or the Tennessee Charity Group. These were 4 charities run by a family that were just bold frauds. They raised money from a gullible public to buy cancer medicine to distribute it in Africa. Does that sound familiar? And instead they just spent it on high living. And so she pushed the FTC to put that group out of business and, get some justice, which happened. And she noticed this Clinton Foundation stuff, so she sent them a letter. And she sent a letter to last year, she sent a letter to the IRS and the FTC and one other, I forget which one, demanding an investigation. The same person who's still there, who I would argue should be carried out of there and frog-marched into a grand jury, who's running the tax-exempt department, sent back a, Dear Jane letter, not even,
wow.
personal letter saying, we'll think about it or something like that. And anyway, Marsha Blackburn did not take that lying down, and as a result, the Dallas office you're talking about of the IRS did have to announce that they were opening an investigation. So what I would say when I got into this March 16, 2015, and wrote that article for Breitbart with so many red flags, why isn't the IRS auditing the Clinton Foundation, which you can read for yourselves because it's still online, I knew then that the question is not, is this a fraud? The question is, how many people have cooperated to stop and obstruct the full and proper investigation of this fraud? How many people are involved? Because there have to have been an awful lot of people in key states like California and New York, in the IRS, around the world, among the donors. How many trustees, how many executives knew about this and decided, and what geniuses decided that we have to cover this up because it's too embarrassing, and just let them still do it? Where are the deliberations surrounding this? Where are the board minutes? In what states and cities were these boards held? Who participated by telephone? How much money was sent to what bank accounts inside and outside the U.S. using wires? How much wire fraud is there? How much bank fraud is there? How much solicitation fraud is there? And who is responsible for this? And then the biggest question of all is, with all this attention, and there has been a lot of attention, how many executives and former executives and donors and others may already be cooperating with the authorities in an investigation? Now, we learned last week, I should have learned a few weeks earlier, from a book written by Cheryl Atkinson that came out on June 27, 2017. We learned on page 242 that the New York Times knew by August of 2016, according to excellent sourcing, that 4 field offices of the FBI, D.C., New York, L.A., and Little Rock, were actively investigating the Clinton Foundation by August of 2016. And the New York Times, that same New York Times, that decided they absolutely had to break the law and publish Donald Trump's tax return to 2005 or whatever on the front page. That same group felt they had to do that, but they weren't going to tell the public about the existence of 4 active investigations in those 4 field offices. And, while I agree with your comment about the politicization of justice and even of the FBI, I really do have great confidence in the field office professionals of the FBI. I think those people walk out their front doors every day, strapping on, I hope, protection, and they face real dangers wherever they are. And they look them direct in the eye and they stare them down, and they bring the worst criminals out there. They bring these people regularly to justice 24/7. So I bet you there are quite a few field office personnel who are irate over what the...
We have heard that. We've heard that repeatedly, that, they keep threatening to leak if something's not done, and then promises are made. And in fact, I heard that earlier this year when Comey made his visit out with all of the field offices, the field heads, that they said they were, this needed to be prosecuted or they were going to leak, and it was Loretta Lynch, is my understanding, that threatened them and said that they would wind up in jail if they dared not let this go. So that we've heard that many of them are working very hard to try and move an investigation forward. I think you're absolutely right about that.
The other thing I would say, I heard this, the Clintons and John Podesta in particular are masterful at these ridiculous arguments that sound good if you have, only a third of your brain plugged in. But this argument that was advanced earlier in the week, Podesta, I think he was interviewed by Katie Couric on Yahoo, said something like, it would break decades of political norms if the Justice Department prosecuted a political enemy of the president. Now, let's think about that for a second. That's exactly how they get away with this charity fraud.
Yeah.
Nobody has ever been prosecuted for these types of fraud. That's because nobody serious, would ever dream of doing the type of baloney these people have done, which is just rampant. Using this as a personal slush fund to fund their political ambitions, to pay for staff people out of pre-tax money, out of donor money, instead of paying it out of their personal pockets. Do you realize I just found, with all the work I've done, I just found there's a form that you have to fill out in a charity where if you are a significant player in the charity, and Bill Clinton and Chelsea and Hillary all would be, if you are reimbursed more than $1,000 for expenses in a year, you have to provide full details of that. And they have never done that. All their travel, never done that. None of their connections.
Chelsea's wedding, they even paid for Chelsea's wedding.
Well, that's the rumor. I haven't seen proof of that, but you're right. I mean, it's just, you're not allowed. See, when you operate a real charity, and I've been involved with some small real ones, people question every potential expense. It's not like you fire up a corporate jet and go around the world, saying, go on African safaris and bringing along mistresses and girlfriends and hangers on and people who want to maybe support your wife as president of the United States. You're not allowed to do that. Every penny that you raise is supposed to go toward primarily to the authorized purpose of the charity. So if you're supposed to be a Little Rock-based National Archive, presidential archive, storing presidential records so the scholars can research them, you're really not supposed to take a donation and fly off to Africa and see whether the water's clean or dirty. I mean, you're not allowed to do that.
Well, Charles, one of the other things you had said, and I'm not sure that I understood you correctly, but I think what you had said was that these other foundations, like the Gates Foundation and other vehicles that have been used by the ultra-wealthy to avoid taxes, they have the same obligation when giving to, say, the Clinton Foundation to determine that it is, in fact, a properly operating foundation. Is that not correct? It's absolutely correct. So there is a distinction between what's called a private foundation and a public charity. A private foundation is was until recently something like the Gates Foundation. That's where, the Trish Negron hits the lotto or has a big successful investment, and you decide to donate appreciated stock that you cost you $50,000. Today it's worth $500 million. You put it in the foundation. You get a tax deduction for this appreciated value, $500 million of stock that you put in that only cost you $50,000 20 years ago. And that, if you're rich and you've got other income, that gives you a gigantic tax deduction. So now you've got these appreciated shares, you sell them out of the foundation. Foundation pays no tax. So now it's got $500 million in cash, right? Right.
In 1969, I believe, was the last time the foundation laws were addressed for reform, and they became concerned. Back in '69, tax rates were very high, so the IRS and the Congress was concerned that people were using private foundations, as you say, as slush funds, and so they instituted new tighter regulations, which forced the operators of private foundations to make sure that monies that they gave for a specific purpose were actually used for that purpose by entities that, in fact, had been organized and had been operated in compliance with the law. And that if you said you were giving money to a 501c3 public charity, it had well be a 501c3 public charity. And the duty was on the donor to make sure that the recipient had complied with the law. And if the donor had reason to suspect that the recipient, the Clinton Foundation, had not complied with the law, there is an onus on the donor to make an attempt to recover the donation in the year in which it was made. And failure to recover it exposes donor foundations like the Gates Foundation to the potential of actually being shut down in a worst-case scenario. If you repeatedly did this, well, the record shows that between 2001 and around 2015, the Gates Foundation has made over 100 separate grants to different Clinton Foundation operations, totaling over $100 million, on $150 million plus dollars or so, to numerous Clinton Foundation entities that are not lawfully organized and operated. And I notified the Gates Foundation last year. I notified other donors last year. And they have done as far as I know, so far, nothing to try to fix the situation. They're just trying to cover it up.
Right, of course. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. Those were the key questions that I think for a lot of people it will help them sort of get a better sense of, where this is all might be going and sort of a little bit additional perspective. So I really appreciate your time, Charles. And I hope we can reach out to you again when the timing works. But I'll be in touch, I'm sure.
All right. Thank you, Trish, and say hi to George and Jason.
Will do. Take care.